we did say that this first conference on sustainable buildings and communities and First Nations is really going to be about starting a conversation. Really, one of the things I've learned over the years of working with First Nations communities, and it's been my great honor and pleasure to work with many of you in this room here at Enoch. We've worked at Saddle Lake and at Blue Quills and at so many of the communities across Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And what I've learned is that so much of what we do in the planning and design of communities and facilities is really about understanding stories and about interpreting those stories through architecture, through the built environment, and making sure that what we build, what we design, and what we construct actually reflects your ability to continue to share those stories with your children and your grandchildren. This is a wonderful little quote from Thomas King, who I think is one of my favorite contemporary First Nations writers, and he always has a way of telling the story that I find quite compelling. And he talks about the fact that he's heard the story many times, and sometimes it changes, and sometimes it changes in the details, and sometimes it's in the order of the events, and other times it's in the dialogue or the response of the audience. And that's really what we're talking about here today. We're talking about starting a conversation between the people who are working and living in First Nations communities and planning and designing those communities. For too long, we've had situations where the people who are planning and designing communities are disconnected from the people who are living and working and playing in those communities. And so I think it's time for a change. As I said, we've had the opportunity to work with many of your communities for many years, but we've also had the opportunity to lead the world of sustainable design. And I have to tell you an interesting story, which is that often when we work in sustainable design, people ask us, well, how did you ever get going on sustainable design anyway? Where did that come from? Because we actually at Manasc Isaac started doing sustainable buildings long before it was fashionable, long before it was trendy, long before we had a LEED Green Building rating system. And so when people ask us that question, we said, well, it really started from engaging community in the process of planning and design. And it started from the work that we've been doing with First Nations. So in many ways, this conference is the beginning, but it's also coming full circle for us, because we started on the journey of designing sustainable buildings and have shared that with many people around the country and around the world. And now we're back to reconnect our First Nations friends and clients and communities with that story, to make sure that the benefits of designing and building sustainably really reach out and back into your communities. So we learn from each other. I think that we have a lot to learn from each other. I think that there's a lot in the world of sustainable buildings that we can learn. Well, you know, we can talk about what's a sustainable building, and I was talking with a few people here earlier this afternoon about teepees. Well, I think you all know that there are traditional ways of living on this land, and that in this particular land, teepees were the way of building. Well, there's probably a good reason for that, because they're pretty indestructible and sustainable and lightweight and energy efficient. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that that's how people lived on this land. And we got busy building buildings and communities that were maybe not so sustainable, maybe didn't fit so well on this land. You know, we've built a lot of buildings around our communities here that really haven't stood the test of time very well. They're not well-loved buildings. Well, maybe they're not well-loved because they don't really reflect our stories. Maybe they're not well-loved because they don't really reflect our understanding of how we should live on this earth and in our communities. So we have the opportunity, and we've had the pleasure, as I said, over many years, to build some buildings that we think are set steps in the right direction. And I'm going to share with you a few examples of some of the projects that we've worked on. My partner Richard Isaac is here, and my partner Shifraz Kaba is here, and those of us who've been working on the design and planning of these facilities over many years. But there's so much more that needs to happen, and so I'll share a little bit of our own projects, but mostly I'll share the things that I think we have the opportunity to do together going forward. Certainly, in some cases, we've had the opportunity to build community in a very positive way. This is the school at Driftpile, and you see this aerial photograph of it, and it sits sort of nicely in the landscape and looks a little bit like a feather. And that, of course, is because the elders asked us to make it shaped like a feather, because the eagles nested there at Driftpile and there were always feathers around. And so this is based on the idea of an eagle feather. And importantly, in the middle there's that circular piece, which isn't just a circular piece, it actually sort of represents the falling down of the feather as it kind of comes down. So imagery and storytelling has always been important. But designing buildings that engage the community is at least as important. So what we're really interested in is creating a vision, working with communities to imagine the kind of place you want to live, work, and play. Engaging the community, as Gary mentioned, is something that we've been doing for a very long time, because sometimes it's much easier to listen and to design and build accordingly. And there's so much more we can do. You know, we've had the opportunity to work all across Alberta, all across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and we've seen that an engaged community is a community that builds sustainably. Sustainable buildings are buildings that people love, and so they don't tear them down. They last a long time. Sustainable buildings are buildings that reflect people's values and vision and image and the stories they want to share. And I think as importantly as anything, sustainability is about engaging young people, engaging the kids in the planning and design of communities, in the building of communities, in the making of facilities. Because ultimately what sustainability is about improving the quality of life in our communities, whether they're on the West Coast, on the East Coast, here in Treaty 6, or in the high Arctic. All of these places, winter and summer, we can design facilities that make sense, that are affordable to operate, that are affordable to live in, and that are great places that you're proud of, and that make the entire community come to life. And of course, because we live here in a place of winter, we have to think about how we plan and design for winter. I know some of you live in warmer places, but most of you live here where it gets cold sometimes. And so in those times when it gets cold, we have to think about our warm blankets. So why do we want to concern ourselves with designing and building sustainably? Why is that important to First Nations communities? Well, as I said, making places that are healthy, places that you can raise families in good health, is critically important. Designing facilities for healing is critically important. Designing places that we can have enduring family connections. And over the years, we've managed to learn a number of lessons. We've managed to derive a number of really important lessons that I think will help all of us going forward to build more sustainably. Well, there are many lessons that we've learned, certainly from all the four directions, and we've been given the gift of many of the elders who've taught us about how to integrate the ideas of traditional cultures, traditional values, and they're different whether we're here, whether we're at Saddle Lake, whether we're in the high Arctic. In each community, it's really unique. And so we've been taught to learn and to listen. When we started, one of the large early projects that we worked on was at Saddle Lake. And when we designed the school at Saddle Lake, it was the first time that a junior-senior high school had actually been constructed on reserve. I still remember the Director General at that time expressing his surprise that we would build junior-senior high schools in a reserve community. And yet these are the facilities that enable and empower young people to continue with their education and to continue with their journey of their lives. And we're able, through the design of these kinds of facilities, to integrate the principles of sustainable design, to integrate energy efficient buildings, to integrate daylit buildings, and to integrate buildings that are symbolic, that have meaning, that have stories embedded in them. In fact, there are each of these buildings, actually, we were given the gift of a specific story, and we've integrated those stories into these buildings. We've worked all through northern Alberta in the design of elders housing, in the design of health centers, and each time we've discovered different aspects of building in a way that is reflective of the vision and values of the community, but also building in a way that we can create facilities that can be maintained, that can be retained, that can be cared for, that can be respected and respectful. We love the idea that even when we build facilities for the larger community, as we did in Whitehorse at a visitor reception center, there was still a very strong integration of First Nations vision and values, because First Nations people participated in our planning and design process and guided us in terms of how to shape our buildings, but also how to make those buildings very affordable. And so you can see here in the Yukon Visitor Center, which is actually now the Museum of the Beringia, that there was a ceremony that took place as part of the grand opening that basically blessed that building to the use of the community, the First Nations communities in that region.